All right, namaste, my friends. Today is July 9th, and let's kind of dive in to Jesus walking on the water. Diving in. That could be a little bit of a joke right there. So, Jesus walking on the water. We've been looking at one specific element because, again, if these stories don't go away, we want to spend some time with them. We want to consider them. And in this case, I think that there's a lot we can get out of not only this story about Jesus walking on the water and looking at the water versus being above the water, but this can also be applied to other stories. So we're also going to kind of take a quick look at Peter Pan and Narcissus, those two stories as well. And if you see that a story is not going away, it just means you got to be with it and you just got to see if you can get more and more out of it. So Jesus walking on the water, the idea here is that we want to be above the water, but I also want to kind of investigate and explore this idea that we also want to be aware of the depth below. Now, to do that, I want to frame this using yin-yang. So the surface of the water in the story of Jesus walking on the water, just like Peter Pan and Narcissus, could represent the border between yin and yang. So if you look at the yin-yang symbol right up here above my finger, this is hard to do because it's opposite on the computer screen. You'll notice that above you we have this white area which has a small black dot, and that is going to be our yang. And then below that we have the black area with a small white dot, and that is going to be our yin. This particular symbol can be applied to so many different things. So one way we could look at it is we could look at it as chaos and order. That's kind of a more contemporary view or contemporary wording of, the black area is chaos and the white area is order. And within order, we have still a seed of chaos, and within chaos, we have a seed of order. We can also use from the Christian tradition, we can call it heaven and hell, and where the black is simply chaos. So if hell is anything, it is entirely chaos. And if heaven is anything, it is entirely order. And on another page in the Black Book, we will take a look at we'll take a look at, is it really a benefit to be in one for eternity versus the other for eternity? And I think that it's a kind of an interesting question to kind of look at. So, but anyway, another thing that I like, with the order, the white area, the yang, we can look at it as the Garden of Eden. And within the Garden of Eden, this white area, the yang, we have this black dot, and that would represent the serpent. So a lot of these stories that we can get a lot of really interesting symbolism behind and learn a lot from. So we're gonna use yin and yang, and I'm going to suggest that Jesus walking on the water is an illustration of just existing on that border, that line between yin and yang. So a couple of stories. I just want to kind of draw your attention to some symbolism because I think that this is important to kind of bring in other sources. So Peter Pan, if you've ever read the story of Peter Pan, I've got it right here, the J.M. Barrie original Peter Pan. Peter Pan is very interesting because Peter Pan, in the title of the book, is actually not the hero of the story the way that you would see this in a Disney movie. This idea that, we want to be the boy who doesn't grow up. Quite to the contrary, Peter Pan's not growing up is really, it's really disturbing. And if you look at J.M. Barrie's description of Peter Pan still has his baby teeth. So if you think about a child, kind of a malevolent child with all of its baby teeth still, you get this idea of Peter Pan. You get this idea of Peter Pan misleading the children to Neverland, and they get to Neverland, and they always want to go to sleep. They always want to go off to Neverland, and I think people even use that term. I'm off to Neverland. That's a rock song. What is that? Metallica, I think. But anyway, this idea that if you follow Peter Pan, if you follow somebody who hasn't grown up, you are going to go to sleep. You are going to go into the chaos. And the deeper you go into the chaos, the less likely it is you're going to return. Now, there's always a bit of order in chaos, just like there's always a bit of hope in the darkest areas of our life. But also, when things are at their best, so this area that's white in the yin-yang, we also have to be aware that there is still the potential of just the difficulty and the pain of life. So we want to kind of experience the interplay between the yin and yang. And Peter Pan is a great example of a boy who needed to grow up, who misled another group of children, who slowly went to sleep, and never fully went to sleep if you read the story. And it's also why Wendy is the hero of the story. I mean, Wendy is the hero of the story Peter Pan because she does stay awake and she eventually comes back. And that is true in the Disney movies, as much as it's looked upon as kind of a fault of Wendy that she, forgets Peter Pan and forgets her childhood, forgets who she is. In the original, the idea was that Wendy was actually the individual who grew up, who actually became consistent, who actually brought order to chaos, out of chaos. And the other story that I found interesting, I thought of Narcissus. So we hear a lot about, narcissistic personality disorder in kind of pop psychology. And we hear this idea. And if you think about the story of Narcissus, here's a picture of Narcissus, a painting of the scene where Narcissus is looking at his reflection in the water and falls in love with his reflection. Well, I was kind of thinking about how we might juxtapose yin-yang over this. So if under the water is chaos and above the water is order, we have Narcissus, who basically refuses to grow up. He falls in love with himself. He falls in love with his reflection. But more correctly, perhaps, he falls in love with chaos. And he gets so enamored with chaos, he gets so enamored with living on that edge between yin and yang, that he ends up, in effect, starving to death, which is the end of Narcissus. So just kind of these interesting elements from other stories that if we apply this to the story of Jesus walking on the water, we just get kind of these interesting ideas of what does it mean to be above the water? Well, what it means to walk on the water, and more correctly, to be above the water, is to be above chaos, to bring order. If you think about the historical Jesus and the time that he walked the earth and walked on the water, he brought order to a very chaotic time. And the order that he brought was basically hope of an incredibly oppressed people who knew an oppression that we who are alive today have probably have never experienced. So now we go back to Father Richard Rohr and this quote. So now that we have kind of this understanding that Jesus walking on the water is really about maintaining full consciousness. So Peter steps off the edge of the boat. And when Peter steps off of the edge of the boat, for a split second, he understands this existence and this experience of having complete peace and order. And yet very quickly, he gets distracted with the chaos all around him. And what happens is Peter begins to sink. Again, idea here is that we would not want Peter to go completely below the surface, because that would be what we would basically say going to hell, going into eternal chaos. So going back to Richard Rohr, we have this quote. One of the great surprises is that humans come to full consciousness, in other words, stay above the water, by shadowboxing, facing their own contradictions, and making friends with their own mistakes and failings. So I think what I'm going to do tomorrow is we're going to talk specifically about how to shadowbox. And I don't have a lot of ideas in my mind right now, but I'll probably do some quick research and see what else I have in the black book. But the idea of shadowboxing, which is also interesting because you can, when you read Peter Pan, man, I'm all over the place as usual, but Peter Pan's shadow and how he loses his shadow, and then Wendy folds it up and puts it in the drawer, and then Peter comes back for his shadow. There's some interesting symbolism as well. But the idea of shadow boxing, that we are, in effect, we are boxing or fighting our shadow, which is a very Jungian type concept. And the idea of walking on the water, which is to focus on the good, to focus on the Christ archetype, to focus on what we might term God incarnate, to focus on that so that we do not sink into the chaos. Shadow boxing is that constant tension that we experience where we are trying to keep our heads above the water, trying to maintain consciousness. And I think tomorrow what we'll take a look at is maybe just some ideas about how do we shadow box? How do we do our inner work so that we can continue to grow, would be a better way of putting it, continue to grow in a way that we become increasingly conscious and increasingly aware of what's going on around us. All right, let's call it a broadcast. All right, namaste, my friends.